officials, members of the diplomatic corps, all private sector represented, academia, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Greetings to those that are also joining us online. We are live on the G20 YouTube page. We also do invite you to contribute to the discussion on X. I'm not sure if X is still a safe space these days, but nevertheless, we are online. You can tweet us and tag the DERCO X page as well as the SIRE page. Ladies and gentlemen, today's session is entitled Advancing Financial Inclusion for Sustainable Development and Economic Resilience. A timely discussion which really tries to probe issues around inequalities of the international financial architecture. What reforms are necessary to create an enabling environment for the Global South to finance its development imperatives, such as climate change, which is a really burgeoning issue recently? Can reforms address the high cost of borrowing faced by the developing economies? These are just some of the issues that resonate with, first, South Africa's foreign policy, but also the priorities that we have set out in the G20. And through the discussions that we will have today, we will try to tackle these issues. But moreover, we also want to have an understanding of the priorities of our Department of International Relations and Cooperation more generally. So the running order of events this morning is that you will hear some opening and welcoming remarks. We will then hear some remarks from our keynote speaker, His Excellency Deputy Minister Alvin Portis. We'll then have a very rich and engaging panel session where we will also invite your interventions and thoughts, after which I will have a very robust interactive session as well, and then we'll have a summary and closure of today's proceedings. So it is lovely to have you, and to do the official opening, I'd like to invite Ms. Elizabeth Sideropoulos from SIRE. Round of applause as she comes up, please.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. The last time I was at the podium was about 10 days ago during our T20 midterm conference in Pretoria. And I came to the podium and somebody interrupted me and said, just hold on, and brought a box so that I could stand on it. But I think this one's a little low, so you should be able to see me. Anyway, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this symposium, which happens traditionally before the International Relations and Cooperation budget vote in Parliament this afternoon. And it's also on a very topical issue, particularly this week, I must add, because of course this week is the meeting of the fourth Financing for Development conference taking place in Seville in Spain, and a lot of the DERCO officials, senior officials, are in Spain, and at the same time it's a few days before the BRICS summit. Earlier this month there were discussions and negotiations in Bonn around COP30. And of course, at the end of the year, in November, will be the G20 summit, which will be the culmination of a whole series of meetings that, as you know, have been taking place in South Africa on both the Sherpa and the finance track. And the reason I flag those international processes is because they're actually all interrelated. They take place in different forums, they take place in different venues, but ideally they need to be coordinated and they need to contribute in a coordinated manner to outcomes that actually address some of the most pressing challenges that we face, that the world faces, but particularly the Global South developing economies. And so the topic today on financial inclusion for sustainable development and economic resilience has really many interrelated dimensions. It's both a national and a global issue. It requires both domestic policy frameworks that foster inclusion and resilience, as much as it requires a global system that is responsive to global challenges and the needs of developing countries. probably not necessary, but I think these days it is, to say that global cooperation and coordination are essential for all of these global challenges that I referred to. But the efficacy, of course, of domestic interventions are also often affected, even where they occur, they're often affected by rules and regulations at the global level. So we can't just be talking about things that we need to do domestically. I've sat in some discussions over the course of the last few months where the conversation is, well, you guys need to do more domestic resource mobilization. Well, a lot of that also plays out in the way in which the global rules make it easier or more difficult for domestic resource mobilization, for example, to take place. And so that's why coordination is critical. The irony, of course, is that while sustainable development and the fight against hunger, poverty, etc., should be the primary goal of international relations and cooperation at this juncture, many parts of the world now have very different priorities. We're talking about rearmament, we're talking about strategic rivalry that manifests in technological competition and natural resource competition, and it's becoming increasingly a zero-sum approach to international politics, which is the exact opposite of what coordination and cooperation should be about. We all know, we've seen the figures about sustainable development goals. We're not going to reach them by 2030. And this has been further compounded, I think, by the recent cuts in aid, which are not just US cuts. We've seen the trend across many advanced economies. And I think the tragedy there is that it condemns many of the LDCs to a particular lot that we had hoped we were overcoming. This year, of course, South Africa is chairing the G20, and a lot of these issues are on the agenda, on the priority list for South Africa to either introduce and drive, or in many cases also to build on the presidencies of the past. And particularly the last 3 presidencies before South Africa have seen a very real focus on developmental issues: the Indonesian, the Indian, and the Brazilian presidency. In the context of the conversation today, just perhaps to highlight a few points, and then I'll stop there, is of course one of the important items on the agenda now, probably since the Italian G20 presidency in 2021, has been that of reform of the multilateral development banks. It's been 2021 or a little later, sorry. I'm now confusing my various initiatives. But certainly, it's been an important one. It's about how we can mobilize the World Bank and other multilateral development banks to raise their capital, to be able to plow more money from multilateral development banks, as opposed to having to borrow from private creditors into developmental objectives. This is clearly something that is on the South African agenda to drive forward. It's about implementation, it's about monitoring of that implementation, and so on. Another important component of the South African presidency is how do we refocus, not undermine the focus on mitigation as a climate action, but also recognize the importance of climate finance, climate adaptation finance for developing economies. Developing economies, in large part, are not in a position really to reduce their emissions that much. There are obviously some exceptions. We are probably one of them. But there's certainly an important conversation to be had about how we scale up adaptation finance. How we also mobilize more money from the private sector and blended finance is another dimension. How we also ensure that there is fairer taxation, which is a very fraught topic. But if we're talking about domestic resource mobilization and countries are not in a position to levy taxes on corporations, all these corporations engage in particular types of illicit financial flows, that undermines the country's ability to raise revenues, to be able to fund their own development. All of these are very contentious issues, they're very important to put on the agenda. They're even more contentious, of course, in the context of certain US decisions over the last few months. But they are important to be, to sort of stay on the agenda and to be part of the conversation. And then, of course, last but not least, in the context of the financial, of the global financial dimensions, is that of sovereign debt restructuring. We lack an overarching framework to deal with debt. We have a common framework in the G20, which has been very slow and hasn't really been as effective as it was hoped, and it certainly doesn't include middle-income countries. So these are all on the agenda. These are all very difficult, but they're all very important. And I always like to say, in the context of recognizing that this is going to be a really very difficult political and geopolitical moment in the G20 and more broadly in global affairs, is that even if we cannot get something by the end of the year, what is critical is to make sure that these things are on the agenda, because they can be picked up at another time. We have a responsibility to drive some of these issues forward, to put some interesting ideas and perspectives onto the table, and then work towards seeing them actualized, even if they do not, they're not actualized by the 30th of November. I think that's important. And then one last point, of course, which is the top, one of the, part of the title of this discussion this morning, which is that of financial inclusion. Financial inclusion has been on the agenda for a long time in the G20, and it's seen the creation of the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion. It's all about ensuring more quality of access to finance, use of sustainable forms, formal financial services. And of course, very much related to that is the issue that has been on the agenda of the G20 for 3 years now, which is that of digital public infrastructure. And I think a really interesting case study of the Indian experience, and how you actually really bring in large numbers of people into the formal financial sector, and how that creates its own particular kind of empowerment. So these are some of the issues that are really, really crucial. Some of them are moving slowly, progressively in the right direction. Others are fairly new in the conversation, like the discussion that South Africa is having around the cost of capital. But they're all really, really necessary to have. And we have to be in it for the long haul, because some of these are really about preparing the ground for some significant mindset shifts in the way in which we understand how the global economic and global financial system works. So I'm really excited to be able to listen to both the Deputy Minister this morning. Thank you very much, sir, for flying down this morning. I think you were right behind me. I think I was half an hour ahead of you on the flight. Really good to have you here again, sir. And then, of course, to the panel discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for those very rich opening and welcoming remarks. I will not attempt to summarize in the interest of time, but it also is my singular honor to welcome to the podium His Excellency Alvin Botha for his scene-setting remarks.
Thank you very much, Rwanda. Let me acknowledge you and obviously Tali, who is the moderator, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me express appreciation for the members of the diplomatic board that is present here today, and obviously representatives from civil society, in particular the youth formations and young people interested in the world of diplomacy. Let me acknowledge the panelists, Professor Mruti from IJR, Snyder from IGD, and Ms. Pearson from SAIA. I actually wish to confirm, Elizabeth, that indeed today it's about foregrounding African perspectives and providing global insights. So the thematic approach of the South African Institute of International Affairs, it's quite compatible and reconcilable with the conversations that we're having in South Africa this year. I also wish to express my appreciation for Mr. Terry Brown, who, without fail, ladies and gentlemen, and we hope young people will do that, I got a note before I came in of the questions that he typed out that he wanted me to reflect on today at the panel. It's quite a complex matter. I'll take you into confidence on them, but I think it's quite a good example of someone that is passionate about his beliefs and keeping us on our toes or accountable. So thank you very much for that, sir. It's really appreciated. Just as a way of introducing myself, ladies and gentlemen, I'm part of the champions of South Africa's foreign policy, which is premised on 4 concentric circles, amongst others, Pan-Africanism, Global South solidarity, deepening cooperation with the more industrialized economies, and of course, transformation of global governance institutions as a catalyst to deepen multilateralism. Our G20 program today, ladies and gentlemen, carrying the theme of advancing financial inclusion for sustainable development and economic resilience. It's evidently a well-timed intervention and dialogue, given the fact that the entirety of the world is today burdened by what we characterize as a polycrisis. And therefore, financial inclusion is no more a peripheral aspiration, but it is indeed a necessary ambition. It is central, ladies and gentlemen, to the cause of social justice, sustainable development, inclusivity, equity, and peace. 1.4 billion people worldwide remains unbanked. Means 1.4 billion people in the world do not have access to any digital capability in relation to the banking system. And of course, what deepens that purview is that in sub-Saharan Africa, less than half of the people still lack access to basic services. That means, ladies and gentlemen, no bank account, no financial insurance, no credit access, no digital wallet. I suppose you would concur that it is essential not only a deficit in service, but is really an antithesis towards dignity, it is a power deficit, and it is a difficulty for young people in particular in sub-Saharan Africa to maximize what we call the opportunity dividend. It is therefore a basic denial of the right to participate meaningfully in the economic mainstream. Financial exclusions, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, in South Africa, as well as in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, still continue to disproportionately affect women, your rural communities, the informal sector, people living with disabilities, and the youth. So our challenges, for example, in South Africa, of trying to mitigate three of your historical antagonism of race, class, and gender. It's a mirror image of what the rest of Africa, and especially sub-Saharan Africa, are faced with. It locks the most vulnerable people into the continuation of a vicious cycle of poverty, stripping them from the possibility of acquiring the necessary tools and possibly to shield them from this polycrisis. Without access to finance, the possibility remains a distant reality for youth and women entrepreneurship. Without the necessary credit facilities, the possibility, ladies and gentlemen, for investment is a distant memory. It therefore holds that financial literacy and services is a key catalyst in our quest to be shock observers in relation to the global economic crisis made increasingly difficult by the war in Ukraine, the genocide in Palestine, and the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is why South Africa's presidency foreground our approach to our value proposition as an African state to the G20 leaders on equality, sustainability, and solidarity. We do this, ladies and gentlemen, because there is an appreciation that apart from the need to transform your global economic and financial architecture, what is a must is the centrality of social justice, equity in relation to that transformation agenda. We know very well that probably half of the delegates today in this plenary hall and 95% of our virtual attendees were not born in 1944 when the Brethren institutions were constructed. It therefore holds, ladies and gentlemen, that 80 years later, this particular architecture on financial and economic mechanism is no longer fit for purpose. Emerging markets and developing emerging economies, including those in Africa, remain underrepresented in decision making. Stringent conditionalities attached to financial assistance have in many cases imposed harsher obligations on recipient African states in particular. And therefore, one of the key aspects in our G20 presidency that we are continuing to champion, ladies and gentlemen, is the high cost of debt, in particular for highly indebted, low-income countries. We are therefore continuing to call for the adequate reform of these global financial institutions, to continue to expand the voice of the developing South. Ladies and gentlemen, our presidency of the G20 therefore have to ensure that the consequent imperative for financing for development should be rooted in the needs of the poorest of the poor. It should be powered by inclusive technology. And it's for this very reason that artificial intelligence is a key catalyst for innovative technologies. It's part of our G20 value proposition. Given the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that we do regard artificial intelligence and technological innovation as a key enabler towards adequate financial inclusion. We have increasingly witnessed in South Africa in particular that mobile banking, digital identification documents, and fintech platforms are transforming our rural economies. We have witnessed in Kenya the M-Pesa system, and we have seen the appropriateness, ladies and gentlemen, of blockchain-backed microcredit schemes in Asia. But it is our submission that these gains remain uneven in South Africa, in SADC, and in particular in Sub-Saharan Africa. We, of course, have to guide between the pitfalls of this new technology, especially in relation to digital divide, where the tools of inclusion becomes the instrument for exclusion for those without the necessary connectivity, digital literacy, or those that continue to have a deficit of trust in digital systems. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, public policy should remain ahead of innovation. Regulations must be inclusive, it must be adaptive, but more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, it must be rights-based. Digital public infrastructure should be universal, secure in South Africa and in the developing South. We continue to underscore that digital finance must be reconcilable with broader social goals, which include, amongst others, access to healthcare, basic and primary education, integrated food systems, and be climate resilient. Here in South Africa, we are, ladies and gentlemen, trying to do our bit by advancing innovative models through the supporting of township and rural enterprises, through various blended finance schemes, and the rolling out of rural financial literacy initiatives, particularly in underbanked communities, which we hope will continue to create adequate pathways for women and youth-led businesses to access financial capital. This is key and critical, ladies and gentlemen, given the fact that when South Africa chaired the African Union, the financial inclusion of African women was a key priority during our chairship. It therefore holds, ladies and gentlemen, that agricultural financial initiatives, particularly for women in agri-food systems, are key catalysts to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDG Goal 2, which advocate for zero hunger, whilst continuing to drive inclusive green economic growth. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, the future of global growth lies therefore not in the already saturated markets in the more industrialized economies, but it are located within the opportunity dividend within Africa. And therefore, for the successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, ACFTA, and for the successful mobilization of Africa's young people as a democratic dividend, creative, digital-based enterprises is a key imperative. I obviously wish to thank you, and I must take you into confidence that we have very high expectations, Luanda, for the three panelists that we'll be discussing today, because I've said to them that the biggest disappointment when you come to an engagement like this is if you learn nothing. So if the splintery and young people on the digital platform doesn't go away with one impressive connotation, then Elizabeth, this engagement would not be successful. I wish you well, and I am very positive that you will honor the minimum expectations that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, DM, and no pressure to the panelists. I think the importance of those remarks, amongst many others really, is how the Deputy Minister is able to take this very nice framing of today's topic and really what is happening at a global level and really merge it with local and regional realities. DM says that financial exclusion affects real people, and these are marginalized and vulnerable people in South Africa, but also in Africa. It's women and it's youth. And here we are able to see how exclusion and the lack of resilience actually has implications for socioeconomic issues in South Africa and in Africa. We heard about access to healthcare, education, and various initiatives that try to empower marginalized groups in Africa and South Africa. So really all these developments that are happening at a global level, and South Africa's foreign policy posture on the topic really has local realities. And it's nice to be able to hear how that actually is linked at a very local level. Elizabeth also spoke about domestic resource mobilization, because again, the lack of reform at an international level does affect our capacity to mobilize resources locally. And again, I think what Africa and South Africa are asking for is a level playing field where there's a just environment, because we do not want to be begging to be able to finance our development imperatives, but we just want an enabling environment where there is equity and the processes are fair. So without putting a lot of pressure on the panelists, and also inviting the audience that is in the room today to also teach us something, and let's all kind of have a discussion that is enriching to one another. I'd like to invite the moderator who will take us through the panel discussion for today's segment. And for this discussion, I'd like to allocate exactly an hour with the permission of the participants for us to go slightly over 12 o'clock for these rich discussions, because we really want to make sure there's enough time for the discussion. So I'll invite Dali, who will then invite the panelists, and we'll kick off the discussion. A round of applause as he comes up, please.
Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to Minister and Waters. It's a pleasure for you to join us this morning. My name is Salmo Jesse with the Ubuntu Radio at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. Deputy Minister, I will, with your permission, I would like you to come back to the podium. I know that we're going to benefit a lot from the panelists as well. I will, with your permission, bring you back to come and occupy the middle seats so that we can also benefit from some of the issues that will be raised on the floor during the question and answer session as well. So I would like to invite you back to the stage. To Minister. Thank you very much. Let's take this opportunity to introduce the panelists as well. Professor Muriti is the head of the Peace Building Intervention Program, Institute for Justice and Reconciliation here in the Western Cape, Professor of African Studies at the University of Free State. I want to invite you to the podium. Let's give him a round of applause, please. Thank you very much. I would also like to take this opportunity to invite Kirsten Person from Zaya. She is the climate finance researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Zaya, and also Masters in Developmental Studies from the University of Cape Town. Welcome. Let's give her a round of applause. Someone who's no stranger to this engagement, and welcome again, Samisha Naidu, the foreign policy analyst and research interests, including democratization in Africa, African political economy, development in African relations, and a number of issues that we constantly engage on. Thank you so much. Let's give our round. Thank you very much. I think I'm going to take a seat right at the end so that also they can have an opportunity to move the podium so that we can actually engage further. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. I want to, because we have an hour, we'll also do the just initial 3 minutes initial thoughts from the panelists in terms of the issues at hand as far as financial inclusion is concerned. The Deputy Minister already highlighted a number of issues as far as the issues of impact and the direct impact that financial inclusions also have. And looking at, we can talk about what some of the issues that are being discussed at G20 level, but also we need to look at the impact it has on the ground as well. But I think we'll start at the top and then go down to some of those impacts, because that's why we're talking about the G20 nations. What are some of the issues that South Africa has put on the table as far as the reform process is concerned of these important financial institutions as well? So I would like to start with you. I know you've done a lot of research as far as climate finance is concerned, but what I've also enjoyed about some of the research you have put out is on the impact that it has on the ground as well. So I would like to start with you, because in terms of some of those issues that you would like to highlight at the beginning.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. I stand on the protocols that we've already established. I'd like to underscore again what the Deputy Minister said. According to the World Bank's Global Index database, approximately 1.4 billion adults worldwide are unbanked. This means that they don't have access to an account with a financial institution or a mobile money provider. I want to relate a true story of financial exclusion. Last year in Cape Town, a cement truck's brakes failed, and the truck plowed into an e-hailing taxi. And when the driver woke up in the hospital, he found himself without his cell phone, without his wallet, so he had no bank card, no ID, and no driver's license. And a year on from that accident, life has become incredibly hard for him. He has a bank account, but he hasn't been able to use it because without documentation, he couldn't replace his card. So he becomes one of over 400 million people worldwide who has access to a bank account but doesn't use it. Then the entrepreneur, small business owner, who owned the car, suffered a financial loss. The car was a write-off and he didn't have insurance. When I spoke to him, he said that he's still saving to replace that car and he doesn't have access to motor vehicle financing. So what does the G20 and multilateral relations mean for the unbanked and for people who have access to accounts but don't use it? Within the G20, there's a global partnership for financial inclusion, and under South Africa's priorities this year, we've got 3 deliverables for that global partnership for inclusion. As an initiative, it started in 2010, and it has G20 member countries, but also non-G20 member countries and other relevant stakeholders that are advancing financial inclusion. And the 3 deliverables, the first one was set by our South African presidency, is to produce a diagnostic report that includes policy recommendations on moving from access to usage of financial products and services. The second of those deliverables comes from the Financial Inclusion Action Plan, and it's to look at innovative technologies and other innovations that improve financial inclusion and also improve the quality of financial inclusion for individuals and micro, small, medium-sized enterprises. And then the third deliverable is to produce an implementation framework for the micro, small, medium-sized enterprises financing. And I think with these priorities and deliverables, South Africa has a chance to leave a legacy on a policy level that speaks to the lived realities of people. So for me, when I look at these deliverables, I see something that is about communities being empowered, about improved economic resilience, and ultimately restoring dignity. And what I would like to wrap up my opening input with is to say that when you look at the priorities that South Africa set for the G20 this year that include just transition financing, include adaptation financing being scaled up, and debt, they are relevant to the global community, but more especially to Africa and the global South. And I think I feel quite proud as a South African to see our G20 leadership setting these kind of practical priorities. Thanks.
Prof. Rich, in terms of some of the issues that you mentioned, and also right at the top level in terms of all this impact and also be achieved when reform is implemented. So many engagements as far as reform is concerned. Well, in order to implement it, but the reform also need to reflect on what is taking place on the ground.
few minutes I have, I think I want to address this issue of what I would call the myth of development finance. Many are heading to Seville with great, great expectations that somehow something different will be done. And the question is, will it simply just turn into another talking shop, perhaps a disappointment for many of us? So we should expose this issue of development finance. Has it really achieved, what we would expect it to achieve after almost 50 to 60 years of talking about development finance? And I think the development paradigm, particularly on the African continent, I would argue has failed quite dramatically. Has not lived up to expectations. There's been very little progress to speak of. And in terms of the African continent, you heard some of the statistics that Deputy Minister Waters already referred to. Africa is very much impoverished. The continent's share of world trade is a paltry sum. Too many of our African Union member states rely too heavily on official development assistance, which is now decreasing, so we need to come up with a plan, particularly given the geopolitical upheavals. I think we say the post-World War II order is coming to an end quite dramatically. Though some of our countries are still relying on this old model of development finance and drawing, funds from the IMF, World Bank, at rates, borrowing at rates that are too high to sustain. So we have a huge problem of debt on the African continent. I think first and foremost, it is incumbent upon us as Africans to take responsibility for the failure of this development paradigm. I don't think we want to externalize this thing exclusively, and to say the mismanagement and the corruption within our own economies on the African continent has been an issue. South Africa, we now have a historical document called the State of Capital Report, which we can refer to see precisely what I'm describing. The failed development paradigm, I think, has been in partly linked to our own challenges on the continent, but also to a large extent fueled by a global system that proposes or at least suggests that development finance will bring about significant change, but what we find is the policies that are pushed by these development finance institutions and adopted by our own political and business elites without the adequate consultation and inclusion, I would argue, of our people, the citizens of our continent, means that we end up with projects and programs that really don't deliver on development, which is a huge issue. And the heavy and unrestricted borrowing, at very unfavorable terms, without the consent of the people, so to speak, then subjugates Africa to a debt trap, which those who are going to Seville hopefully will address directly. And I think we have to expose the illegitimate nature of the decisions made by the development finance institutions and the doctrines that Africa adopts, almost wholesale, untransparent, unaccountable, without benefiting the people of Africa. The statistics are devastating. Almost 40% of the world's poor are on this continent. 60 to 70 million children don't have access to education, malnutrition, facing conflict. 600 million of our fellow African citizens do not have access to electricity, which is vital for any economic transition. Our brothers and sisters in Joburg now don't have any water. That's another issue. So I think the myth of development financing has to be exposed. And I'm not too optimistic about the conversations that will be taking place in Seville. We've seen it all before. It might be just another glorious talk shop, might be just another theater of the absurd. I think even though we rely on so-called development financing, we need to come up with a different plan, the one that pushes our autonomy and agency, and one that actually gives us the ability to address the issues that we need to address in a practical manner. So we go to Seville with a pinch of salt, perhaps a whole bucket of salt, even. And let's push the African agenda. We've heard some of the issues emerging in terms of climate financing and addressing the debt trap, and also reforming the global financial architecture. I'll stop there, moderator. I see you are getting a little bit restless in your chair.
I'm getting into the issues now, deep into the issues. Thank you so much. So, Anusha, in terms of, we continuously becoming part, to continue to participate in these important multilateral platforms, including the World Bank, the IMF, and they say they are not favoring, as far as some of the issues and the modalities are not favoring countries in the South, but we will continue being a member. And why are we continue to actively involve? But in terms of, that's a part of our G20 priorities, we said we need to push for debt relief, especially for countries in Africa and also developing countries as a whole in the global South. But we're keeping participating. When should we start seeing the movement on that?
Thank you, Daniel. Again, let me also extend my gratitude to Saya for inviting me to this very interesting platform every year, and I really enjoy it, to the Deputy Minister who keeps us on our toes, and of course to my panelists and all of you. It's a difficult question to answer because you actually have to ask yourself is the viability, the utility of the multilateralism right now. How valuable, what's the value proposition of this multilateral system that we have? And I think very often the challenge is that the multilateral system is in a state of what the Minister spoke about, and that is in a state of polycrisis, in the sense that everything is now not what we have been used to, and it's going through a systematic change. And for the Global South, I think it's part of that systematic change. And that to try and find that common ground, or what we were discussing earlier around consensus, is it a sufficient consensus, is it a qualified consensus, again makes it difficult, because I think we have to go back and remind ourselves around why the G20 was formed in the first place. It was formed precisely because of crisis. It emerged out of the 1996 Asian crisis and evolved. And it evolved in a state of crisis. It kept responding to an international system that was very much in a systemic nature, and an international system that constantly had to deal with how crises in the global economic architecture was being dealt with. And we see that evolution from 97, 98 with the Asian crisis. It then moves to the more higher level engagement around 2007 and 2008. And then it starts to elevate itself in terms of the fact that at the time with which these 20 countries are identified as the key actors within the G20 in terms of defining the moment, engaging in the space, but also addressing the crisis. The question then becomes does it stay the same, or is there a changing nature of not just the global north, but of the global south, in terms of who are now moving up the chain and the rank and the file? So I think our crisis comes from the fact that it is reactive. And we tend to look at the indices and the indicators with a bit of a difficult lens. And that is precisely why we're having this question or this conversation about, we've had all of these initiatives, but we're not seeing what's coming at the end of the tunnel. We're not seeing whether it has been effective. It has been effective, but perhaps, again, a qualified effectiveness, because it cannot be done in a way in which it is a one-size-fits-all approach. And so the challenge we're having is, do we then try to create something new? And I think the big question for South Africa's G20, and having to deal with a presidency in light of who's going to become the incoming president, which is the USA, and it's all this uncertainty around whether the USA is going to be taking on the G20 in the manner that we've seen in the past, or are we going to see a kind of different iteration of what the US will bring to the G20 is because we're not sure where we are right now, because it's so difficult to predict. And so the issues around financial inclusion, the issues around economic resilience, etc., is really this question that I feel that we are not talking about in this discussion, or even in the context, is the model flawed, the model around which the G20 is built? Because the model in itself creates the kind of trickle-down effect. And the trickle-down effect, in many ways, we have seen it not performing in the way that it should actually have created this kind of articulation around this idea that you will eventually get your turn. You just have to be patient. And I think what we're beginning to see is that impatience is now becoming the level of the protest. That the G20, the multilateral reform agenda, which is not fast enough, not inclusive enough, and not equitable enough, and not creating equivalency in terms of things like what Elizabeth mentioned earlier, is domestic resource mobilization. Domestic resource mobilization is caught up not because we cannot find that mobilization of resources at the domestic level. I think one of the things that we found in projects that we've done is that South Africa has money. But the problem is the rules-based system tends to create a set of challenges that kind of act as a disruptor to that. So the one thing that you ask yourself around the G20 and around these questions around, with regard to how much are you willing to basically start doing what you say you want to do is take illicit financial flows. Simple things that come out of things like mispricing of products, where money leaves the continent in such massive ways, but you cannot get that money back. I think this year alone, or I don't know, in the last couple of years, I saw a figure, and I stand corrected on this, it's about $90 billion that is leaving the continent in illicit financial flows. We're not talking about the debt question here. We're not talking about debt payments that Africa has to make, which is in the region around about $85 billion, which is what Trevor Manuel had indicated in an interview as the head of the Africa expert panel. We're talking about illicit financial flows. But if those gaps are plugged, which is wins that can be made in the G20, but it's not being done because, again, the question is, how do you align back to your national domestic constituencies? The corporates who are there, invisibly in the room, in the G20, who don't have an interest to basically address illicit financial flows. Or those in the banking sector who don't have a vested interest to say, well, we feel that there is a right that can, wrong that can be righted. In terms of the financial exclusion, et cetera, issues with regard to bringing that money back into the continent that can be used to address some of the points that Tim raised around donor dependency and the development paradigm failing us. We know the neoliberal model has not necessarily been about equity. But I think what we are beginning to see with young people, which is quite fascinating, is that their argument is, we are no longer going to be like our parents. It's not in our name will you make these decisions. And I think that in itself is a question around, can this G20, in terms of the question you asked, are they willing to be as bold like the Starship Enterprise? I'm not a Star Wars fan, but like the Starship Enterprise, to go where no one else wants to go. Because I think that will mean that you have to be clear that your idea of a multilateralism is not about what your vested interest is. The idea of multilateralism, reform of the international financial institutions, and also this question about whether the special drawing rights in the IMF should be used as a global reserve currency in terms of how it's equitably used, can also be important wins. So I think this is a nice way for us to segue into the idea that you don't have to leave an institution, or you don't have to basically say, I don't want to be part of it. But I think the institution's fit for purpose needs to constantly evolve in terms of changing structural conditions and economic and social transformation and inclusion. I'll stop there.
there's a number of issues that one will want to expand on, issues of consensus, but I also want to zoom in. This is Africa's G20. How much resource? We talk about climate. I want to come to Ms. Pearson in terms of when it comes to climate, which is your area in terms of climate change and all the research around it. To say Africa has got a number of resources. We heard about the illicit financial flows leaving the continent. To say how well do you adapt here as a continent to be dealing with the challenges that we have first and foremost? To say, by the moment we enter into those important multilateral platforms, we already can use our own currency to say, and also our own advocacy to say, we've already done this in the continent. Then it's a model that you can adopt, right? And I want us to, just in terms of your experience, how are we dealing with the issue of climate financing, but also some of the challenges around that? Is the consensus easier to reach because it affects everyone?
So what I can say about my work in climate finance is that sometimes it's honestly depressing.
Okay.
So we're heading for a kind of reckoning when it comes to COP, in that we're not on track with, last year was the first year that we exceeded the 1.5 degree Celsius increase since pre-industrial levels. And so we're overshooting the Paris Agreement goal, which is not, it's a sobering space for us to be in globally. And so I think this kind of poly-crisis situation means that we definitely need a lot more urgency in the reforms that we are able to navigate in the multilateral space. And at the same time, we have these geopolitical headwinds that are actually taking us a bit backwards from the kind of things that leaders have agreed to in the past around climate. So yeah, climate financing at last year's COP, there was a new collective quantified goal for the amount of climate financing that we need. And it was brought up from 100 billion rands a year from developed countries to developing countries, which needs to be their commitment because they're the major emitters, to 300 billion a year. But the actual need runs into the trillions. And the issue around climate financing is actually it's not that there isn't enough money. The money isn't being purposed in a mission critical way, as Mariana Mazzucato inculcates in us. There's about 7 trillion rand a year being spent on fossil fuel incentives. So these are the kind of things that are urgent to grapple with, and we really need to see a shake-up in those multilateral spaces.
Yeah, that's quite important. Before I go to Deputy Minister, Prof. Mriti, in terms of some of these issues I mentioned, I want us to look at this important institution. But I also want you to come to Africa now, because I know that in terms of some of these issues raised by Ms. Naidu, as far as the content is concerned, in terms of how do you then use Africa's resource optimally?
Yeah, this is a big question, isn't it? I mean, this is the challenge for us because I mentioned at the outset that corruption, mismanagement of our economies is in fact a huge factor. As Sanusha just pointed to, the 90 billion that is leaving the continent on an annual basis. So I think the first thing is we have to be serious about this and control the things that we can control. As citizens, I think it is incumbent upon us to actually hold our political leaders to account. You heard Deputy Minister thanking, I think, Mr. Crawford Brown for his 5.3 subsection question. That's precisely what we need to do. Because if our governments are not pulling in the same direction as the people would like them to pull, then we've got a massive problem, right? So, in fact, Africa is perhaps the wealthiest continent in the world. I'm going to be bold and say that, in terms of natural resources. And that's the reason why we have probably more than 60 to 70 military bases of the global north countries here. The US alone is 29, Russia 20, UK, France 10 each, plus China has one in Djibouti and has an operation in South Sudan. These friends of ours from the global north, they're not here for our interests, regrettably, in terms of these military bases. They're here to protect their bounty. You've heard the discussion of 30% of critical minerals are located also on the African continent. Until we can get that right in terms of our own agency to say, okay, guys, that's enough, really. We have 1.4 billion people. We have these massive levels of poverty. We have to find ways to work as a continent together. And Deputy Minister mentioned the issue of Pan-Africanism. We don't often say it enough in our corridors, in our braais, and this is a throwback, I would argue, to colonialism and apartheid. Né? It has almost turned us into these very insular, fragmented units, nation-state units, which in fact are artificial at their heart, at their core, right? So if we're going to protect our resources, we need to first of all be able to work together as a continent. If we're not able to do that, we're going to struggle moving forward. This year, the African Union has adopted the theme of justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations, right? And I would like to link the issue of reparations to the issue of climate change, I would say climate justice, and maybe even climate reparations. Minister, I'm not sure if you're familiar with climate reparations. So he knows it, so he hasn't learned anything new yet. We're still working towards that goal. So I would say on the issue of reparations, I know it's an item, an agenda item that the Global North is really not interested in. It's very much an African agenda that we're putting on the table. But if we can be quite creative and say, let's link this to the issue of climate justice. Because there's the whole dimension of the loss and damage fund that we need to operationalize, right? And so if we juxtapose the reparations prism onto the issue of climate justice, then the Global North can actually contribute to creatively addressing these two birds with one stone. I think we have to help them think in that way. Minister, your colleagues going to Seville must help them to think in this way, because it's not something that's going to come natural to them. And this loss and damage fund, I think we've been talking about it almost endlessly, but it can contribute towards addressing also the debt cancellation issue, the debt trap that we've been discussing in this conversation. I don't know if, moderator, you want me to keep going? But the, yes, the continental free trade area, very quickly, the continental free trade area is a massive game changer for us. That is opening up all our countries to so-called free trade or trade without restriction. But linked to the continental free trade area was the protocol on the free movement of people. And we know how difficult it is to get visas to go anywhere. In fact, South Africa, regrettably, Deputy Minister, is one of the most hardest countries to get into in terms of visas for our brothers and sisters in the rest of Africa. And then a single air transport market. Next week, I'll be traveling to Equatorial Guinea, but I have to go to Addis Ababa to come back this way, whereas it's just a few countries this side. So it shows you we have a lot of things to do to position ourselves to maximize our resources.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Prof. I think one of the issues we haven't touched on is the role of the private sector in collaboration with that whole important private-public partnership. How critical is it? And Deputy Minister, before I open the floor, I also know that you have made a lot of input before as far as our critical mineral strategy is concerned. There's been a lot of number of issues that have been raised. Maybe you can reflect on some of the issues that have been raised before we open the floor, Deputy Minister.
Thank you very much. Obviously, I must be firstly expressing my concern that I'm technologically disadvantaged.
you have learned something.
And young people are looking at this discussion and saying that who's supposed to be the youngest are using a mic and everyone else uses a microphone. And so we need to get that right. No, thank you very much. I think, look, it must have knowledge the repository here. The matter about critical minerals, it's a key issue. It actually presents the biggest, what I call, opportunity dividend for, in particular, the African continent. If you look at the contemporary matter in the Great Lakes region, especially the conflict that arose in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the DRC. Apart from the ethnic origins of the conflict, the current haven that the DRC poses as a very deep reservoir of critical minerals. It's at the center of the conflict. And we had very robust discussions during the past South African EU summit, because I think the listeners should know that South Africa is one of 10 countries worldwide and the only African country that have what we call a strategic partnership agreement with the European Union. And we had to engage in Brussels and now in South Africa very difficult debates with our partners in Europe that in as much as through the peace facility of the EU Commission, the Europeans have played an important role to help us to, for example, get to grips with the insurgency in Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique. But we raise important issues concerning to us that if you look at the index of critical minerals that countries from Europe acquire from the Great Lakes region, it is quite naive for them to continue to believe that we are not conscious of the fact that they are purchasing critical minerals from countries who do not have that critical minerals industrial complex. So if you look at what the DRC produce, vice versa, some of the countries in the Great Lakes region, it's not reconcilable. So we had very difficult discussions, and I suppose our panelists would understand that unfortunately I can't name and shame because of the diplomatic constraints. But I suppose, as the professor said, the truth shall set you free. I think it's important that young people must understand the difficulties, and our responsibility as government is to then engage through bilateral engagements, through multilateral structures with our partners where the conduct is an antithesis of what we are. So that is just one example. The second one that I want to raise, because South Africans are very critical and ask, what is the value in executing foreign policy? Do we seek to mitigate on the troika challenges of, in particular, unemployment? We had, and it's a very important discussion on climate change and, our nationally determined contributions, UNFCCC and just energy transition pathways. And I think what we have agreed is that by, 2035, this was in Baku during COP29, by 2035, there would be both private and government mobilization of 1.3 trillion US dollars in relation to climate financing. So that is the agreement. So the European Union, for example, and European countries are part of that agreement because we speak about just energy transitions. So in this important multilateral engagements on the Conference of the Parties, they agree with us. But what the European Union Commission then does is to take a very unfortunate decision to institute what we call CBAM, your cross-border tax adjustment mechanism that, for example, says if we export any products from South Africa that have a carbon footprint, they will levy up to, I think, up to 30%, 25 to 30% cross-border tax punitive measures against us. So once again, we have an obligation, and we are engaging very hard with the EU Commission, that the decisions is not reconcilable with the very important decisions that they've made in the conference of the party in Baku in COP29. And I just thought that it's important to take, audience into confidence on what is the very unique difficulties that we are dealing with, but that we are continuing to speak about. The last issue is about South African social agency. With the war in the DRC, South Africa obviously are involved via SADC, and because of the expanded conflict, SADC with the East African community had a joint summit under the tutelage of the AU champion on peace and reconciliation, the Angolan President Lourenço, where we sought to engage in peace diplomacy. However, what leaves a bitter aftertaste, and I say bitter aftertaste because I think we should be the first to express appreciation where peace diplomacy work, is that the African peace and security architecture have institutionalized the process that I've just underlined on these two regional mechanisms under the AU champion. But unfortunately, an agreement is made outside of the African continent. It leaves a bitter aftertaste. We are happy that there has been peace diplomacy that are materializing, but the agreement on cessation of hostilities are made somewhere else, and the decisive variable in that is on the consequent future of critical minerals. Thank you very much.
It's quite important as we want to take this opportunity to open the floor. Already I've seen Deputy Minister will be quite excited about this. Young people already are the first one to speak, so we're quite happy about that. If I can just get assistance with the mic right at the back, with our colleagues at the back, if they can assist us with the mic. I've recognized you at the back. You'll be the first one, and then I'll go right to the table behind you. That will be the second inputs. Because this is a high-level meeting, I know that there will be inputs, more inputs also, but also questions as well. So we'll take you, and then I'll go right at the back. Yes, sir.
Thank you so very much, moderator, and the great submissions from our panelists. I'll start with the critical minerals comment. I appreciate that I had an interview with the Deputy President of the Afri-Exim Bank, and we appreciate what's happening between Zambia and Congo. They're setting up a manufacturing processing plant, and with our engagements with the Minister of Mineral Resources, there's quite a lot that is happening where Africans are saying that we have to take care of our own minerals, but also a value addition to what we produce. I also wanted just to highlight what Ms. Elizabeth mentioned around structured finance. Perhaps the Deputy Minister can respond to, if I look at the website of the department, we are looking for finance, not just for development, but we're looking for more finance to host the G20. We need more budget, I think. But just to highlight, if the Minister can perhaps, Deputy Minister can perhaps comment on the state of readiness of the G20, as well as the President mentioned that the G20 is a continental G20, because in South Africa, we're a small economy. We can't compete with Brazil or some of the big economies, but we have to think first nationally, but also continentally, how we can take advantage of that. So what is the state of readiness on that? And then you also mentioned in terms of structured finance, blended finance, on how we can develop. And I think we need to find ways to come together as a continent and to have pan-African investment to be able to address this challenge. And lastly, I appreciate that I'm involved with the launch and the discussions around the launch of the Africa Energy Bank in September. But I would appreciate if they can be invited to the table at the G20 so that, because in every development you need capital, and what we do not have is capital. And we don't just want to be consumers of AI or digital solutions, but we want to be producers. Thank you.
May you just please introduce yourself, because I think I omitted that at the beginning.
My name is Oliver Chikutsero, and I'm with Financial Insight as well as Africa Rising TV.
Oh, right.
Yeah, like Oliver Tambo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll right at the table behind you. I will come to you, preferably at the front. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, I think, everyone. My name is Odile Bulten. I am a former UNICEF staff member. I'm a retiree now, and I try to keep intellectually challenged and motivated with all these forums. So I've been online participating, and now first time in person. I have retired in South Africa at the end of 2022. I am from the diaspora. I'm from the French island Caribbean of Martinique. And I wanted to come back to the continent to be able to actually share my contribution and my experience from a UN perspective, but also from a mentoring perspective for the youth that we are looking at, who are going to carry the Agenda 2063, because we are not going to be able to do that, but we need to pass the baton. I just want to build on what the Deputy Minister said. I really felt ashamed that we were not able as a continent to broker the peace between DRC and Rwanda. For us to, let's say, delegate this type of processes to outsiders, and big outsiders, and we all know it's the United States of America, is really a very bad aftertaste, like you said. But it is also demonstrating that, oh, you see, we cannot take care of ourselves. In a very, very short time, the peace deal was signed. But most importantly is the impact, because the critical minerals are going again to go out of the continent. So my point is, how do we, as a leader for a year of the G20, as a member state of the African Union, as other platforms such as the BRICS and some of the other ones that have been mentioned earlier, how do we actually leverage our position to actually influence these things and try to rethink internally? Let's stop the blame game of the former colonial powers and all of that. We need to take responsibility. We need to make the changes that need to be made, and I think we need to empower the youth. How do we do that? We have the education curriculum. How are we changing our education curriculum on the continent to do youth empowerment, digital literacy, AI, and all of that? And I was very, very surprised how the youth, the Y20 webinar, came up with so many unbelievable ideas and recommendations. So my kind of a cry is to really, for us internally, inside, kind of put our heads together and say, look, as a continent, what are the options that we have? We know what they are. We know what the possibilities are, and I think we have a very distinguished panels that are reinforcing that. But it's the implementation, the monitoring, and actually acting upon those. Thank you very much. Who's the next person?
Thank you very much. I've just want to acknowledge, I'm going to come back, or you may go ahead. I'll come to you right in the front. Yes, after this one. Thank you so much. Because I know that you've already handed in your question, and the Deputy Minister already went through it as well. Let me go to the back, yes.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm standing here as a graduate from UCT and a person who's underemployed. I just want us to focus back on the issue of graduates who are not employed. I want us to look at the I would say that's a resource that is being wasted away because we're not being placed in places where we're supposed to serve the purpose that we went. For many years, you go and study hoping that you're going to get an opportunity to express or to be active in the economy, but we haven't gotten that chance. So I want us I want the panel to address the question of unemployment amongst graduates. I also want to respond to the global crisis. My question is, what are we taking away from this crisis management? What plans do we have to prepare for preventative measures instead of being responsive? Because I know that in America, people have bunkers there. If there is an earthquake, people go to their bunkers and they have food supplies that can last for months. I mean, the government is prepared there, but what are we doing as South Africa or Southern Africa or Africa for that matter to ensure that we prepare for other crises like COVID-19? Because I graduated during COVID-19 and I never gotten a chance to go to an interview, to express myself, to showcase the skills, the initiatives that I've been part of. So I want us to address those issues. What can we do to prevent that from happening again? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just one at the front, and then we'll come back to the podium. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Terry Crawford-Brown. I'm a member of SIA. My question is, the Treasury has just announced that South Africa is borrowing $1.5 billion US, or call it 25.5 billion rand, from the World Bank to remedy the Eskom corruption and chaos. Given the US abuses of financial hegemony and the US dollar, why is South Africa now borrowing from the World Bank in Washington and not from BRICS Development Bank? Thank you.
Yeah, a number of issues that came through. I know that there are some of the issues that we might want to respond to. Sanyusha, is there some from the onset, some of the issues you want to raise, to respond to?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the participants for the question. I want to circle back to critical minerals, and I think it kind of comes to the issue of implementation. The critical minerals is one that we have to think about as well as we think about it in terms of economic industrialization. We think about it in the context of how it's going to address our industrialization and our integration into the global economy with regard to beneficiation. We've got to think about critical minerals as also a geopolitical issue in terms of why suddenly now it's being identified as that important factor, that important issue that is becoming the pivot in negotiations. What is it that is actually fueling this undercurrent around the critical minerals? I want to make one point about critical minerals, and when I listen to way the interpretation of what the benefit of having critical minerals is, we tend to also make the assumption that when you take the mineral out of the ground, it will be automatically beneficiated and voila, you'll have an EV. It goes through process. And the question I am constantly coming back to around implementation is, what is the process of beneficiation? Your value-added addition of critical minerals is what components do you require from critical minerals? So when you're thinking of your end product, what is it that you want to do with the critical mineral that's going to create the kind of integration, the value-added addition, as well as the industrialization so that you can become part of the global value chain, whether it's in the production of electric vehicles and so forth. I don't know if anyone remembers, years ago there was this whole thing called World on a Plane. It's a plane that's made up of component parts from different countries. So it was the Boeing, and it was World on a Plane, and so the wings came from China, the engine came from France, the front wheels came from Japan, And that's what you need to think about with critical minerals, is that if you want to start thinking about critical minerals as a part of your in G20 or your industrialization process, etc., then you've got to think about what is the specification that you're going to be using in order to move something that is raw in the ground to go through its process of value addition and beneficiation to become part of the component part of a vehicle, and whether it's the battery or whatever. So that's, I think, we have to be very clear of. We can't talk about critical minerals in a vacuum, but neither can we talk about critical minerals as something that just automatically is taken out of the ground and you do X, Y, and Z. So that is why I think it circles back to the point about why there is this geopoliticization of critical minerals. Because it's about who controls the global value chains. In addition to the fact that it's about peace and security. In addition to the fact that critical minerals are becoming part and parcel of a new kind or a renewed kind of extractive conflict. Whether it's between DRC and Rwanda, whether it's between how we actually use it in the context of tariffs and the impact of tariffs. And the question of what the Deputy Minister spoke about, and that's CBAM as well. What are you using to actually beneficiate that? So it's not just about, what do we do with critical minerals? Critical minerals in its own is as an entire industry built on different types of interventions, but different types of conflict, security, etc. The most profound issue around critical minerals is how it may be used to fuel what we consider as traditional conflict. And that's the missing middle in the G20, the peace and security question, in terms of how do you deal with conflict. Not just conflict around whether it's tariffs or what happens with what you call this increases of tariff around a product that's much more beneficiated, but it's also about what are you doing in terms of dealing with what some people like Mary Calder at the London School of Economics calls new security wars. And new security wars are built on this in that space. So I think we've got to be careful as well when we talk about these dynamics, because it can actually fuel more militarization. It can technology can become much more military industrialized as an industry, and we're seeing it in the context of that. And thirdly, I think it raises questions around, again, the question of climate. So there's an interlocking set of issues that we have to start thinking about as issues that are essentially mushrooming off each other around the critical mineral spectrum. The last point about employment, unfortunately, it's very difficult to answer that question in terms of what can be done for creating employment. It's a difficult one because we keep having this debate about whether the GDP growth rate is a kind of indicator and benchmark for creating employment, or where you should be in order to have growth and development, etc. But I think just as we find it difficult to answer that question, the issue really is something that I didn't hear much about in the G20 around the financial economic resilience question. It seems to have slipped off the radar, and that's the township economy. And the township economy in terms of what does it bring, particularly because your question around the G20 is also based on structural conditions. Each country's structural conditions are not the same. And so certain countries will actually create that entrepreneurial spirit in terms of how it's built around the township economy, or how it's built what the Brazilians did as the favelas, and how they created that commerce, that commercial activity around the favelas. So I think we also have to think about what are the conducive conditions that are created. And this is where perhaps I feel I may be a bit out of sync here, but this is my personal view. Government does not create jobs. And they are not job creators. They create enabling conditions for jobs to be created. And to a large extent, I think, not to be unfair to government and to the Deputy Minister, is they have to find that right architecture in order to create that. And sometimes there are circumstances outside of their control that they cannot create that too. So this is where your private sector comes in as well.
Yeah, I wanted to mention about that. Thank you so much. I think that's important because also we do have stakeholders who have been also part of who are supporting the G20. I've been engaging with them before this meeting, and before the meeting started. Let's talk about this issue of the continent and the resources. I know that there's a tendency when we talk about finance, we really not really delve into the political aspect of it as well. And there's a tendency of looking at, you look at what's been happening in Central Africa and also in Sub-Saharan Africa as far as even the recent peace deal, to say there's a financial aspect to it, but also there's a peace. So they say, just how expensive is peace in Africa, right? So you need to, we always have to commodify peace and development as well, that when we talk about this sustainable development as well in the continent. Prof. Richard.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me pick up on the points that Sanush and Deputy Minister have been making, but also listening to my young sister from UCT, it's quite painful to hear that, we have this much talent and unfortunately we're not using it. It's a huge loss to our continent. This is also the reason the Gen Zs in Kenya were protesting and protested last year, 2024, 2025. This year, you saw it just a few days ago, in fact, really triggered by a sense that they have worked so hard, they've got to a point of having their degrees, but the economy is unable to absorb them. Meanwhile, the government is positioning itself to borrow more from the IMF and the World Bank through the finance bill, which would consign future generations to having to pay that debt off. So it's a challenge not only restricted to South Africa, but also to other parts of the continent. But let me also agree with Sanusha that, in fact, this is where the private sector has to come in much more strongly. The job creation dimension cannot be addressed exclusively by government, national, provincial, municipal. The JSC, we understand there's almost $6 trillion US floating around in the JSC, making more money for itself. And we've got to find a way to convince the private sector that rather than extracting those financial resources outside the continent to make even more money, they should rather start thinking or changing their mindset and thinking about how can they, in fact, seriously support youth entrepreneurship programs, which will even transfer skills. Forget about the danger of losing the money. So the private sector is very risk averse. It wants policy coherence. It points to the last 30 years and says, no, we're not going to invest in Africa because we're not sure we'll get a return on investment. But I think the mindset really has to change because the continent is not going to be able to move forward unless the private sector really comes in a serious way of social entrepreneurship, creative ways of investing. The sense of that we're clever, we can make money, we have the lawyers, we know how to get the money offshore. We can do tax avoidance. I mean, that's such an old model, such a dangerous, because at the end of the day, when you're driving down the M3 and you have a pothole on the road or you see a mass of young people coming, you will be frightened because your house is not completely infallible. It can be penetrated. So it's actually incumbent upon you to try to make South Africa truly a home for all, to make Africa a home for all. So I would invite the private sector to start thinking slightly outside the box. You have these expensive thinkers, please get them on board and help you to think outside the box on how you can seriously engage much more directly. Very quickly on the peace dimension, I share the sentiments of our sister from Martinique. I've never been to Martinique. I would like to go there one day. That is the home island of Frantz Fanon, who wrote The Wretched of the Earth, a staunch Pan-Africanist and a very forward thinker. So thank you for being here and also challenging us. And the issue on peace and security and the Washington deal is really a criticism of the mindset that unfortunately some of our governmental leaders still have of viewing our 55 states as individual, atomized entities, and they're only really in it for themselves. Whereas, again, the big question is how can we, again, adopt a Pan-African mindset? How can we respect our continental structures, our African peace and security architecture, the the Luanda process and the Nairobi process to try to solve the DRC conflict. These were deliberate attempts, but almost you rebuff this and you go to Washington because you've been summoned by the naked emperor, and he signs a deal for you, and you're going to get a kickback. He's going to get a kickback. It's like Oprah. Everybody gets a kickback. But it is also a criticism of the existing global system of international collective security. The United Nations Security Council has collapsed. It's not functioning anymore. When you turn on the TV, you look at UN TV, you'll see them saying stuff, but they're not really doing anything. So God forbid any of our countries rely on the UN Security Council. It's not coming. At least the African Union will try to send somebody, then they'll be rebuffed, and then, our institutions are still not strong. Our AU also is failing us. Let's be clear. We're not going to be touting AU. Sudan is a case study of where we've dropped the ball as an African continent. And that is the agenda of transforming the United Nations Security Council because it's not functioning anymore. But the pathway to do that is to invoke Article 109 of the United Nations Charter. Deputy Minister, are you familiar with Article 109? Finally, we found something that the Deputy Minister did not know, and he's leaving this room with Article 109. I'm not even going to describe it. He has to go and read it. Article 109 calls for a general conference to review the United Nations Charter. It was in the original document in 1945 in San Francisco. 80 years. It has never been invoked.
Article 109.
So we need the South African government, we need DIRCO, in fact, more specifically, to put this. In fact, DIRCO has already made a statement, by the way. India, Brazil, and South Africa, the IPSA Forum, issued a statement in November last year. Paragraph 11 actually makes a very specific reference to Article 109. But I know because we push IPSA, because of BRICS, we've got G20, we are overburdened, we are flat out. Luanda is not going to sleep until December. South Africa has an opportunity to lead on this particular issue, Deputy Minister. You were going to receive additional body blows in the same way you receive body blows when you put the Palestine issue at the ICJ. But because South Africa is already used to receiving body blows, I think this is just one more step. And let's take those body blows, but we curate that conversation. We mobilize the numbers we need in the General Assembly, and it cannot be vetoed by the Permanent Five, and it cannot be, it needs a simple majority in the General Assembly. So it can be done in practical terms. A lot of diplomatic capital, probably lots of sleepless nights, probably 1 or 2 phone calls from Washington, Beijing, Moscow, saying, what are you doing? But South Africa is already doing it, so I think we've got to carry on, guys. We've got to carry on doing this. So please, familiarize yourselves with Article 109 of the United Nations Charter. Thank you.
Prof, thank you so much. Apparently, we are always punching above our weight, so it looks like we are used to the punches.
And some of us are heavier than others.
Thank you so much. Is there any critical question on input that is outstanding before I go to Pearson for some climate issues before the Deputy Minister push? I probably have like 10, all right, 2, I have probably like 20 seconds each, making nice and concise. I'm gonna start with you right at the beginning, and then I've got 2 hands here, and I will make it very quick. I'll come here, this will be the 3rd one, or the 4th, and then I will just, I've got Nelson right there. All right, you'll be throwing punches, I know. Okay, that's great, thank you so much. I recognize you as well. Make it nice and snap, 10 seconds if you can.
I'm Sipogazi from the University of the Western Cape. I'm quite interested in knowing how the G20 is integrating principles of social justice and equity into financial reforms and developing financing strategies to ensure global economic decision they translate into tangible improvement for the vulnerable population on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Done it in 10 seconds, well done.
Hi, I'm Peter Fabricius from Daily Maverick. I wonder if I could ask the Deputy Minister a kind of a pretty basic question, and it's been part of the discussion generally around the G20, but you're better placed than anyone else in this room to answer. To what degree is the US now cooperating or not cooperating with the G20 evolving whatever structure or final communique in November? And to what extent would that certainly, at least relative, absence of the US impact on all the resolutions which you're expecting to be passed at the summit? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll go to the next question right here. Just behind you. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Lusani, a scholar of international relations. Just a quick one, maybe two things. First one is maybe an update on COMED, especially looking at the fact that Prof. Muriti spoke about the private sector coming in, really partnering with government to create jobs both within our borders and on the continent. What is the update on COMED? And then the second one is maybe a response to Prof. Muriti. Whilst it is good for South Africa to punch above its weight, it's very imperative that the rest of the African continent also comes in to support that. We cannot throw one child to the fire whilst the rest of the siblings are looking and saying, no, they will fix it because maybe they have the resources, the intellectual capacity, but, to, yourself, the rest of our African brothers and sisters, it is imperative that when we even speak of a critical minerals deal, it is an African stance than just either the DRC or South Africa, etc. This is why we're calling the G20 an African G20. And it's usually South Africa that leads in that respect to carry the African continent, but whilst everyone is quiet. So to the rest of our African brothers and sisters, come, let's hold hands, and let's do it together. If we're going to the ICJ, let's go together. Not necessarily by resources, but by strong statements of support. Yeah, that's my response.
Thank you very much. Just behind you, immediately behind you, yes. Are you having a consensus? Is there a consensus who's going to start? Reach a consensus speaker, yes.
My name is Eroni, and I am from Citadel Wealth Management. I just want to respond to Prof regarding private sector. Because we look after private funds. We are an asset management company looking after over 100 billion of individual assets. And the reason why we do not invest with the government, or the reason why the private investor do away or shy away from investing, is that, just to rectify on the JSE. So the JSE market cap is currently sitting at 25 trillion rands. So you are correct, there's a lot of money floating. But the reason why there's lack of investment is because private investors, they don't have trust in government. That's the first one. Secondly, private investors are profit-driven. That is just a fact. And private investors think long-term. What is the long-term financial burden to the investment? Fourthly, unequal bargaining power exists, which is the reason why they don't invest. And lastly, it's the risk of corruption. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. I think she's bending. Let me just give her a 10-second, please. Yes, madam.
Okay, very quickly, as a youth involved in these talks, thank you so much for the opportunity. I want to know about the line-by-line negotiation points, because that's something as youth that we really rely on to continue championing these causes. And the two things I'd just like to know about, for example, Kirsten earlier mentioned about the 1.5 degrees. If you look at the Copernicus Institute statistics, Africa is below 1%, below 1 degree. but the European continent has been above 3.5 degrees for over a decade. And so what kind of wording in the line-by-line negotiations can we as youth rely on to keep championing the cause for a just transition?
Lovely. Thank you so much. Nelson?
Thank you. I'm standing because I don't want to be seen as hiding from the panelists.
Thank you so much.
I was provoked by Prof. Moriti there regarding the issue of the African states, their number and his assertion that they are fragmented and there are too many. I think that I should remind the Prof that, in 1963, when the founders of the OAU came together in Addis, they decided that Africa had to respect the borders that existed, that were drawn up in Berlin, because failure to do so, they would have been distracted by a new debate about who amongst them will control which part of Africa. They decided in their wisdom that they had to stick to the borders that were drawn up in Berlin so that they don't get distracted by that type of a new debate. So it was a very wise decision in my view. I don't think the issue of the functionality of African states has to do with their number. You look at Europe, how many countries were in the European Union? There were 28, one of them pulled out. So you still have a lot of other countries in Europe which are not members of the European Union, which I'm not going to bore the panelists with mentioning. But that is not an indication that Europe is fragmented. In Africa, all the African states are members of the African Union, all of them, except with the point that some of them have been suspended from the AU, from participating because of their failure to adhere to democratic principles. In the past, you would know very well that the AU would have welcomed those member states, including the situation that you referred to in Sudan, where there was a coup d'etat. In the past, before the AU refined its processes and constitution, the leaders of the coup d'etat in Sudan would have been welcomed in Addis Ababa. But recently, you know that the AU had taken a decision that if you come to power through unconstitutional means, you are not welcome in Addis. You cannot even participate in AU processes and meetings. So there has been a shift at the AU in terms of what level of adherence to democratic principles or what failure constitutes or will lead to in terms of consequences. There are consequences now. And you also look at how the African states are attempting to integrate their economies through the African Free Trade Area Agreement, which has been, there's been practical steps taken towards, implementation of the AfCFTA, which South Africa has been driving. And we have had one of the first shipments coming from South Africa that takes place under the AfCFTA. So it's not all doom and gloom. That's the point that I'm trying to make. There are some practicalities and positivity that is being driven by the African Union. We are not exporting our problems to the US as you're suggesting. I want to suggest to you that Rwanda and the DRC going to the US and finding agreement on a thing doesn't mean Africa is exporting its problems to other parts of the world. And I want to say that you wouldn't have said the same during the time when the African states got involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They traveled there, they met President Putin, they met President Zelensky, and there was some sort of agreement there where we saw some of the children that came from Ukraine being returned home to Ukraine, which was a direct intervention by African states. I don't think you would have said that, the Ukrainians and the Russians are now exporting their problems to Africa. You wouldn't have said that. So let's welcome when other role players are helping to find a solution somewhere in the world. Africa is also playing a role in Europe where there are problems. When the Europeans come here, don't say, no, we are giving our problems to them. We don't want to solve them ourselves. Thank you.
All right. I know that the program director, I'm already on your time, over 10 minutes or so. Can you just critically, I know you need to respond on the quick issue of the climate, and I want to get the Deputy Minister to wrap up on this issue. I think we're going to benefit also to engage after lunch, during lunch studies, on some of the issues that were raised. Yes, quickly.
So I want to reflect a little bit about how these sort of global dynamics play out in our own South African context and in other African countries. So one of the things that South Africa is championing is the cost of capital in the G20. And it's a very unfair facet of how the financial architecture works, that developing countries pay about 6 to 7% on loan financing, and then the global north pays around 2% or less. So that is something that's quite unfair, and in our own domestic circumstances, when we take loans, it's crowding out spending on health and education and so forth. So Terry raises the question of the loan that we've just taken, and I think we're seeing a little bit of a shake-up in South Africa about public participation in budget processes. And so normally it's been on the spending side, but we're becoming aware that, you know, the VAT increase on the revenue side and the lending decisions are something that also bear to have public participation, because ultimately it's us as taxpayers that end up paying back and are forfeiting our health and educational outcomes. So I think these are the kind of things that are really squeezing countries. They've got lack of fiscal space, and they're finding that they're paying a lot on debt. And so we've put that on the global agenda, and I'm quite happy that we've done that. And then we've also put the adaptation finance there, which is very, very relevant, because coming to the common but differentiated responsibilities, we as Africa only emit 4% of global emissions. So surely we have a different type of responsibility to the countries that are emitting hugely. So we expect them to give us better concessional financing, and to not only put the financing into mitigation, which is an issue for them more than for us, but to put it into adaptation and loss and damages. So that is something that we also, as South Africa, have put on the agenda, and which I think is very relevant to us in Africa. And then just my last point is that at a recent F20 Climate Solutions Summit, one of the speakers said, we need African solutions for global problems. And I think this is such a nice mind shift, that we're not a passive participant, we're playing a leadership role here in the G20. We get to set the discourse, and we get to come with the solutions. So, yeah, that's my sort of punt.
Thank you very much. Deputy Minister, because of time, I would like us to reflect some of the issues I mentioned from the floor. I know there's a lot of also issue in terms of our development banks, BRICS banks, and all the other issues that came through. If you can just give a wrap of some of those issues, yes. Deputy Minister.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me maybe just extend the invitation. The Minister Lamola, I think you have landed from the BRICS ministerial engagement. He's anchoring the Terco's budget speech today at 4:30. So there's a number of issues, I think, in relation to G20 that I think it will be advisable because of our time constraints now, that everyone tune into the parliamentary channel at 4:30, where he will detail the work in terms of our high deliverables and also across 13 engagement groups. And let me also maybe make the commitment that I think it's needed that we come back here, because I think there's very important engagement. For example, with the Y20, it's an engagement group, and as we prepare for the Y20 summit, I think it's important that the detail of all the engagements groups should be spelled out. So I think we will have to find, Elizabeth, some mechanism, probably and a more lengthy type of a time where we detail the work that has been done across the engagements group. I think that will be probably one of my advice. There continues to be obviously difficulties within the Troika. We are the last of the developing countries that are chairing the G20, and it's imperative for the success of the G20 that the US, as the incoming presidency, are part of actually the November summit,
And I think President Ramaphosa has been unequivocal about that issue. Because that will define, in essence, the outlook of the US for the next 3 years, next 4 years of the presidency, whether it is a champion of deepening of multilateralism, given its own acknowledgement that we are in a world that increasingly are being characterized and has been universally been accepted as a world of that are characterized by multipolarity. Because that is what the Secretary of State Rubio have actually said. But we need to then juxtapose that with the fact that should they not provide the necessary leadership, being part of the Troika, they could easily fall into the difficulty to be being characterized as a hegemon, as a big power that are obviously waging a spirited pushback against the evolving multipolar world. And that is obviously the important issue that we continue to discuss with them. They have obviously, at the ministerial level, has participated when the finance, through the finance track, so that was obviously encouraging. But we require them to engage more deeper in the Sherpa track, and that is a key and critical issue. I obviously wanted to just say that you know, the issue of African social agency is a key issue, and that's why our key priority really is Pan-Africanism. And how we do that as South Africa, you know, we have been criticized as being a reluctant hegemon. But if you look at our solidarity, find expression to SADC, our economic diplomacy in SADC find expression through SACU, the South African Customs Union. Because we understand the important role of building bridges and taking the collective word. Obviously, the one issue that as Africans broadly that we need to continue to criticize is our reluctance to be complete Pan-Africanists. For example, we submitted a case against the State of Israel in relation to their deeds against the Palestine people. When we submitted, we had 14 countries internationally that joined. 2 were from Africa. Only 2. Now look at the social injustices that Africa were confronted with, continue to be confronted with. And it politically, it says that the Ubuntu philosophy that we are aspiring to is not necessarily reconcilable with the ethos of everyone, and it can't be, because it's an antithesis of Pan-Africanism, not to care deeply for where a social injustice is perpetuated. And look, at the end of the day, the difficulty of Africa is leadership. It's leadership. And I've raised it very importantly in the past, Tali, as I conclude. What was the difference between South Africa that have neglected to execute an international criminal court warrant against former President Bashir in South Africa, and South Africa that were willing to execute an ICC warrant against President Putin? It was leadership. Because President Ramaphosa decided to engage in very unique diplomatic finesse and directly engage with President Putin on our obligations as it relates to the Rome Statute. Very direct. Vice versa, taking the short route, which has proven not only in the world of diplomacy, but in life, it's not actually the most positive decision, where you wanted to save a political relationship and abandon the constitution, such as what happened during former President Zuma's time. And so the central topology of African social agency is African leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May we give a round of applause to the Deputy Minister and the panelists. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. May I hand over to you, the Program Director.
Really, another hand of applause for this panel. I think it is just amazing. And just by a show of hand, and here I'm crossing my fingers, if you learned anything new or had an enriched perspective after this panel, just by a show of hand, to indulge Deputy Minister. So I think we succeeded in what we set out at the beginning of this panel, and we apologize. We apologize for running over time, but we really thought that the engagement and interventions from the floor were really, really important as well. So we do encourage that we continue with the discussions over lunch, which will be served outside. But also just to ask for the panel to please step in front for a photo, if Kutsia could assist us in facilitating that process, while we welcome Elizabeth to just close us off and give us a summary of discussions and then a vote of thanks. Just very briefly, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to thank, and then you can take a picture? Okay, well, I'm not going to take up too much time at all. It's really just to thank the panelists, thank the Deputy Minister. It's really great to have you here and to have you also not only give the keynote, but also engage in the discussions. And then, Tim, you should not have said 25 years. But Sanusha, Tim, Kirsten, it's been really great to listen to the panel. I think the point that you raised around creating a forum for the engagement groups to actually present some of their findings, it was really instructive to hear a number of the engagement groups present at the third Sherpa meeting in Sun City last week. And the Youth 20 was there, as well as us as the Think 20. But I think that creates, I think the idea is a really nice one to actually bring together and to have an opportunity for a little bit more in-depth discussions on some of the items on the agendas of the respective working groups. I'm not going to try to make any comments or respond to any of the issues, but just to thank you as well for being here. Thank you to the DIRCO team and to the SIRE teams for organizing it today, and look forward to seeing you again either in Cape Town or in Joburg, where it's much drier, even though it's cold. So thank you all very